Welcome to Meet Monumental Historic Women, sponsored by Lex Seher and Lexington Historical Society. Lex Seher has a focus on women, but we welcome people of all genders. Lex Seher is a group with a mission to make the contributions of women visible in Lexington. Our town does not have any monuments recognizing women, and we have initiated an effort to establish a monument to honor women in a visible place in Lexington Center. Lexington is the stage for a critical chapter in American history and democracy, but Lexington's public monuments only tell half of our story. So we're working to make our history inclusive and to recognize the important contributions women have made to Lexington. We invite you to join us by making a donation to Lex Seher. A link to Lex Seher donation page will be in the chat, and you can learn more about us at our website, lexseher.com. Our speaker series was established to promote the mission of Lex Seher by making women visible in Lexington. We use these forums to learn about the contributions women have made and the history of women in our town. The Lexington Historical Society currently has an exhibit at Buckman Tavern titled "Something Must Be Done, Bold Women of Lexington." This exhibit has been an inspiration to residents and visitors to learn more about Lexington women across history. Lex Seher has also learned about important women from our 5-month open nomination process. There is a common thread that ties all of us through history to the women you will hear about today. Ultimately, that is what the Monument Initiative is about, making this thread visible. Today, we are going to learn about 3 women who are featured in the Something Must Be Done exhibit, and 1 who was nominated from within the community. Sarah McDonough, Programs Manager at the Lexington Historical Society, will talk about Ruth Buckman.
Can everyone hear?
Yes,
Okay,
very good.
great.
Thank you.
I've been with the Historical Society for 12 years now. And so Ruth Buckman is someone who has been near and dear to my heart for a very long time, spending as much time in her home as I have. And she is one of those elusive women who really epitomizes that well-behaved women rarely make history quote, which was not meant to say that women don't count unless they make history, but that they just don't end up in the history books unless they do something extraordinary. But that doesn't mean that they weren't an integral part of their communities. And what has always struck me about Ruth's story is that she did pretty much everything that her husband did, but because his name is on the tavern and his portrait is in the tavern, he's the one that's associated with a lot of these events that took place here in Lexington. And probably my favorite thing about the Buckman Tavern is that originally it belonged to Ruth. She was the granddaughter of John Muzzy, who was the tavern's original owner. So she would have spent an incredible amount of time in the tavern throughout her childhood. The period in which Ruth was growing up is a little fuzzy in terms of both the tavern records and just the town records in terms of where her family was living. Her mother, Jane, was John Muzzy's daughter, and her father, Samuel Stone, was, apologies, the phone is ringing, chosen by John Muzzy to be sort of the heir of his tavern because his eldest son became a deacon of the church. And so he was not about to go running a tavern as a side gig. We know that John sort of stopped being active in the tavern in the 1750s, and we think that Ruth's father, Samuel, might have started helping out at that time, although the records are sketchy. So she would have been about 10 years old at that time. She was born in 1744. And so throughout her childhood, she would have been around the tavern, seeing how the business worked, and then eventually helping her father when he officially started running the place in the 1760s. And it was kind of an interesting circumstance, a number of family tragedies that led to the Buckmans taking over this particular building. John Buckman grew up, as some of you may know, in what is now the Monroe Tavern. And his father and mother both died within a week of each other in February of 1768. And then Ruth's father also died on April 2nd of that same year. So the two young lovers were left with just one parent between them, Jane, who was at that point officially in charge of the tavern, and John and Ruth were married in July of that year. So at that point, it officially becomes the Buckman Tavern, and they take over the business, and to the extent that decades later, it's still known as the Buckman Tavern, even after other family members have taken over, which I think is pretty incredible. So John had a little bit of retail experience from his father's business that William Monroe eventually took over. But Ruth was really the one who had been around inside the tavern and doing that behind the scenes work for pretty much her whole life. So in addition to the usual housekeeping that a colonial woman would have to participate in, she was also helping to run a business. And I like to think that she was likely quite a bit of an equal partner because the Buckmans were childless. They only had one son, a John Jr., who was born in 1770, and he only lived for 10 days. So we don't have any records of what sort of help they may have had around the house. They are not listed in the tax records as being slave owners, but we do not know if they had any kind of paid servants or indentured servants of any kind living in the house. If we assume not, that is an incredible amount of work for a single couple to take on. I'm going to attempt to show a photograph here of the Buckman Tavern, just for anyone who has not seen the picture in a while of what this place actually looked like in 1770. So this is the famous image of the Battle of Lexington, and we can see Buckman Tavern here sort of in the center left of the picture. But what I think is important to remember about how a tavern operates is that it is an incredibly large business. So it is a 3-story building. There are 4 rooms on each floor. There are 10 fireplaces in this building that need to be tended to, 4 on the first floor, 4 on the second floor, and 2 on the third floor. And then there is also a large barn off to the side and several other outbuildings, including a small cider mill. So this was a huge booming operation, and Ruth would have had to take care of a number of animals on the property. The Buckmans had, I believe, 5 cows, 2 sheep and or goats, 2 pigs, 2 oxen, and a horse. So Ruth was the one milking, feeding, haying, all of that alongside John. So we're not entirely sure who would have been sort of the most mathematically inclined in the family. We can assume that John was doing most of the books, but Ruth's position would have meant that she was constantly running around this place, including doing the cooking for the people coming into the tavern and also the laundry, which was an incredible amount of physical labor. And this, of course, is not just for a family, but for anyone who is coming into town. Buckman Tavern was known as a drover's tavern from the very start. It's basically a large truck stop. So not only are locals coming in for lunch, for drinks, particularly on Sundays, this was a place to get lunch, but also anyone who is coming and going to market would be stopping here. So the records are quite scanty from the family, unfortunately, about sort of who was in the tavern at any given time, how many people were staying overnight. But the third floor was fully kitted out as a hotel, essentially. And there was also a ballroom on the second floor. So as well as travelers, the other big thing that the Buckman family was participating in was politics in the town through allowing town meetings to take place inside the tavern. John was pretty active in town politics. He actually was the official meeting house cleaner and bell ringer for a while. And when the town meetings were not taking place in the meeting house because it was too cold, they frequently took place inside the tavern. And what is particularly important is that this kept happening even after that became illegal. So one of the most interesting parts of the revolution for me was that period just before things got really crazy. Sort of in 1774, following the Boston Tea Party, there was a regulation set in place that basically said town meetings are illegal unless you are voting a new slate of selectmen. Your entire itinerary has to be submitted to the governor for approval before you can meet. Wow. They very much did not do that. In December of 1774, they had a meeting both in the meeting house and then in the tavern where they voted solely to follow the regulations of the continental and provincial congresses rather than General Gage's government, to pay taxes to the provincial congress instead of to General Gage, and to buy bayonets for a third of the militia in town. So this was taking place in the tavern under the watchful eye of both John and Ruth. And what I think is particularly poignant about how the tavern is set up, if you have been in there recently, you may know that the room that we have set up as the meeting room, what we call the West Room on the side of the house, is connected to the ladies' parlor, which is a more private area in the back. Now that doorway may have been changed over the years, but we do know that at least from the mid-19th century, there's no door in there. So what I do like to think is that the women were certainly in the back of the building, eavesdropping on what was happening there, formulating their own ideas. Ruth, as a very busy married woman in 1769, would not likely have been at the spinning bee, but it is very likely that that spinning bee was formulated in that back room. And you can actually see Anna's house from the window of that room, which I think is really great. We have a lot of sort of periphery information, but just in terms of Ruth being in this place and watching over these political events says quite a lot to both her and her husband's involvement in the revolution. Even just as normal people, they were part of what was allowing the revolution to actually happen in a democratic way in Lexington.
Thank you.